to this kind of sober and thoughtful conversation about public affairs, even controversial ones. In recent days and weeks, there's been a lively and I think very thoughtful discussion about the topic of tonight's talk here in the Student Journal on campus, at the dinner table, and of course on the all-student listserv. And that sort of thing seems to me awfully good. It's just the sort of conversation that these kinds of events are supposed to start. Right? The center is able to function in this task, of course, only with the generosity of our supporters. We're endowed in part by the National Endowment for the Humanities. And tonight I'd also like to thank in a special way the Thomas W. Smith Foundation, whose ongoing multi-year support enables lectureships like this on a regular basis. Our speaker this evening, Charles Murray, is currently the W.H. Brady Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He is a political and social scientist and an unabashed libertarian. His several best-selling books include one on welfare, the 1984 book Losing Ground. Mr. Murray's work on welfare arguably paved the way for the 1996 Welfare Reform Bill and was credited by former President Bill Clinton as doing the country a great service. There is, of course, also his 1994 work, The Bell Curve, on the relationship between intelligence and class, and what it means to be a libertarian, from 1997 and several others. His most recent book, Coming Apart, is what brings us here together tonight. It looks at the subject of growing class divisions in America. This is a good topic to talk about anytime. It's also useful for us here at Canyon and for the center to talk about this because it previews the subject of the Center's next big conference. Next spring in April 2014, we'll be doing a big conference on the politics of inequality. So you'll be seeing more about this topic in the coming year. Coming Apart belongs, I think, on the same bookshelf as a number of other books that have talked about the same problem issue in recent years. Books like Holding Alone by Robert Putnam, Bobos in Paradise by David Brooks, and The Big Sort by Bill Bishop. Coming Apart's been reviewed in the New York Times, I think, alone, on three or four different occasions. And even those critics, in the New York Times and elsewhere, that disagree with his analysis, respect nonetheless his description of the problem. Nicholas Kristof in the New York Times, for example, says, I disagree very much with what he has to say about the solution, but I respect his analysis of what is a very important problem. Here at Canyon, many students read Tocqueville's Democracy in America, the theme of which is, of course, the equality of conditions. All societies have class structures, but in Tocqueville's America, Tocqueville's telling, the upper class of American society, by the force of the democratic impulse, is in a way embarrassed not to be seen as part of the average middling part of democratic society. What Mr. Murray depicts is that something's changed. Something's changed from Tocqueville's America. And in his words, he deplores it. So I would now ask you to please join me and give a warm opinion welcome to Charles Murray.
Thanks, John. Thank you very much. You all had to come through a thunderstorm to get here. I did too, and I appreciate your making that trip. I thought we might have 10 people in here as I was walking across a rain-driven Kenyon campus. The thesis of Coming Apart is very simple. The argument is that we have, over the last 50 years, seen a development of classes that are different in kind from anything the United States has known before. The United States has always had classes. Every society has classes. We've had rich people and poor people. The rich people have lived in somewhat different parts of town than the poor people. All that is not new. What is new is a divergence on basic behaviors and values, and a falling away on some parts from institutions that formerly were shared, and in other cases an isolation that we have not known in the past. And what I'm going to try to describe tonight is the basis for that statement. There are a couple of things I'm not going to do. I am not going to talk very much about causes, particularly about the formation of the new lower class. And the reason of that, for that is that that gets to be very contentious. I am on record with losing ground as saying I think the 1960s bear a heavy burden of guilt for triggering a lot of the trends that I'm going to be describing. I also know that a whole lot of people violently disagree with that argument. But we are now faced with a situation which is, and I know this phrase is used glibly, this is one case in which it is true. This is not a Democratic problem or a Republican problem or a conservative problem or a liberal problem. We are talking about threats to the American project that transcend those lines. And the recognition of the problem itself is the essential first step in trying to figure out what we might do about it. So you won't hear much about causes in that regard. In the numbers I'm about to give you, I'm also going to be focusing on non-Latino whites. The subtitle of the book is The State of White America, 1960 to 2010. Why whites? Because that really clarifies the issue in a variety of really useful ways. I'm going to be talking about social problems that in many cases historically have been deeply and closely identified with issues of race and ethnicity. Okay, if I present the national numbers, it is not only natural, but it would be completely normal for you to say to yourself, well, to what extent is Murray talking about a national problem? To what extent is he talking about a problem that is located in certain segments of society? Talking about non-Latino whites gets rid of all that. I will say parenthetically that in the penultimate chapter of the book, I say, all right, all of these trends I've talked about, I will now show you the numbers for the entire national population. And guess what? They just track very, very closely with each other. We are really talking about a national problem, but everything I say is about whites. I also limit the age for a lot of the numbers you're about to hear to people ages 30 to 49. And the reason for that is that we've seen lots of very important social changes whereby, for example, in certain classes of American society, the normal age of marriage has gone way up. The age of retirement has come down. By concentrating on ages 30 to 40, I put aside a lot of those other influences that have been going on. So, whites ages 30 to 49. And I'm going to begin by talking about the formation of the new lower class. In the book, I have an argument about the founding virtues. The founders were very interesting in this regard. They had formed a limited government with the Constitution. Every single one of them explicitly said this will not work without certain virtues in the people. And furthermore, they were reasonably consistent about what they said those virtues are. It's not an iconic list, but the four that I focus on are ones which every single one of the founders in writing said the American people have to possess this fundamental characteristic, or else limited government will not work. One of these was industriousness, and if you want to talk about a single signature characteristic of the American people, that's probably it. Not just industriousness in the sense of hard work, but in the sense of wanting to get ahead, to rise in the world, to make a better life for you, your children, than you had yourself. A second one of these was marital morality. That's the way the founders referred to it. In fact, when they used the word morality, they were really talking about fidelity within marriage, and they were contrasting American marriage with the decadent European forms of marriage, which they felt were far inferior. But the marriage being the fundamental building block of society, they took as absolutely for granted. The third was honesty. Again, the Americans saw themselves as being a plain, simple, honest people, as opposed to the decadent, devious, Machiavellian Europeans. And the fourth was religiosity, which is interesting because Jefferson was a deist. Washington and Hamilton and Madison were all professed Christians, but they were very vague about their adherence to traditional points of doctrine. They were men of the Enlightenment. Only Adams really was a devout Christian in the orthodox sense of the term. Ben Franklin, of course, sort of went his own way on this as everything else. However, all of them, again, said of religiosity, you have to have a religious people because first and foremost, with the form of government that we have established, you have to have self-government, meaning the government of individuals of themselves. And that the only way you can have a persistent form of self-government is through religiosity, in which people see themselves as obeying the dictates of a moral order that is not ad hoc, but is given from on high. So those are the 4 founding virtues. And what I do is track the changes from 1960 to 2010 in the founding virtues. And for that purpose, I use my definition of the new upper class, the upper middle class and the working class. Real quickly. Upper middle class, as I define it, means college education and working in a managerial position or in a professional position. Working class, as I'm using the term, means no more than a high school education and working in a blue-collar job or a low-level, low-skill service job. All right? Let's start with marriage. And I'm going to start with marriage and probably spend more time on marriage than the others because I think it's probably the central social phenomenon that we've seen. I think that the changes in marriage cascade over into a variety of other domains. Here's the story. In 1960, whites ages 30 to 49 in the upper middle class consisted of 94% married. There are very few social statistics that come as close to unanimity as that, 94%. In the white working class, ages 30 to 49, you had 84%. There was a difference, but it was pretty trivial. White working class communities were organized on the basis of married couples. Fast forward to 2010. In the white upper middle class, you're looking at 84% married men. So there was a reduction from 94%. But it had been stable for about a quarter century. Since the mid-1980s, it had been pretty much varying between 83 and 85%. And furthermore, divorce had been declining over that same period. So as of 2013, you're looking at a lot more first marriages and only marriages than you were in 1984. Marriage is alive and well in the upper middle class. It's the basis of the organization of communities. White working class, ages 30 to 49, 2010, CPS statistics, current population survey statistics, 48% married. From 84% to 48%. It is really difficult to come up with a lot of other divergences, class divergences over a period of time that short and get that big a change. Why do I focus on marriage? 2 broad reasons. One is that among scholars of both left and right, I think this can fairly be called a consensus among the people who are familiar with the data. Children's outcomes, whether they consist of their mental health as children, their likelihood of dropping out of school, their likelihood of getting involved in drugs, their likelihood of becoming unemployed or going to prison, you name it. Almost whatever the outcome you're talking about, there is an ordering of outcomes for children statistically by family structure, after controlling for income, maternal education, and the rest. The children of 2 married biological parents do best. Next come the children of divorced parents. Doesn't make much difference whether they remarry or not. Third comes together both the children of never married women living only with their mother and the children of cohabiting parents. For the United States, cohabitation is somewhat different in Europe, but for the United States, they're at the bottom. This does not mean that there are not single women raising children who do a wonderful job. Yes, there are. If you are saying that you have 1,000 kids from 2 married biological parents and 1,000 kids from never married women, and you control for education and maternal education for income and the rest of it, you're going to get important differences in the flourishing of children because of family structure. The second reason, and in many ways, if you're talking about the survival of the American project, the more important reason has to do with social capital. Social capital, of course, is Robert Putnam's term and the social science term for all the different activities that go into the glue that holds communities together, whether you're talking about Little League teams or lobbying for a 4-way stop sign at the city council or PTA meetings or all the other ways in which people are active in their communities in jointly solving problems, whether they're governmental or voluntary. It is simply a statement of fact that a great deal of social capital is generated by two married parents who are trying to create an environment for their kids that they want. There are very few unmarried dads who coach Little League teams. And there are very few unmarried moms who have the time to go to PTA meetings or otherwise invest a whole lot in the community just because of the demands of their time. You get a big slash in social capital as family structure changes. And what that means, not in a statistical sense, but in a day-to-day way in which neighborhoods function. Working class neighborhoods don't work as well as they used to work. They are not places where people can solve their own problems and deal with things the way they used to be able to do them. The same kinds of changes and divergences happened with the other three founding virtues that I talked about. With industriousness, the big change is in males. In 1960, if you were a male of prime working age and you were not paraplegic, you were either working or looking for work. And if you were not doing either one of those things, you were seen as a bum. You were seen as a bum by your girlfriend, by your mother and father, by your friends, by the community, and by the society at large. A man who was not working or looking for work was a no-good. And as a consequence, almost everybody who was a male was in the labor force. As of 2008, and I use that year instead of 2010 because those numbers were collected in March of 2008 before the recession set in. You were up to 1 out of 8 white males ages 30 to 49 who were not even looking for work. During the Q&A, I'm happy to entertain questions about whether this is globalization, whether this is stagnation of wages, about working class, and all the rest of that. We can talk about all of that. I will simply say this real quickly. If you think that this problem of males out of the labor force is going to be fixed if we have a booming economy and lots of good-paying jobs for low-skilled workers, and we hold on to that for a few years, and Murray's problem is going to go away, I have just described the last half of the 1990s. Didn't go away. Not only didn't go away, the problem didn't even get better. So if you're going to tell me that the solutions are economic, I'm going to say we've been there and we tried that and it didn't work then. You've got to tell me why it's going to work the next time. We have seen a cultural change in the work ethic of white males. Of all males, but you can document it specifically for whites. I would also suggest to you that it's not rocket science to figure out that this is in fact a cultural change. And what you need to do in order to demonstrate this, and this is true of you if you're a faculty member here or if you are a student, is spend a couple of weeks going down every night and drinking in a working class bar. Don't take a clipboard and an interview pad with you. Just sit there and drink with people and let them talk to you and get in conversations. And here's the kind of thing you're going to hear. You're going to hear about a class of men who, of course, we wouldn't hire those guys. Those guys don't want to work. If we hire them, they're not going to show up on time. They're going to quit after the first couple of weeks. You will also talk to women who have not married the father of their child, and they're going to say to you, why should I marry that person? You know, he's a nice guy, but we have fun together, but he can't hold on to a job, never has been able to hold on to a job, and to bring him into the family would be like bringing another child into the family. Something has changed, profoundly important. Religiosity. Religiosity, why is it important? If you are not personally religious, well, here it's important again because of social capital. You go to Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone, and at that time, that book was published in the late 1990s, I believe. At that time, you had half of all volunteering, half of all philanthropic contributions, and half of all membership, which was directly religious in character. And furthermore, those who are religious are much more engaged in secular forms of social capital than people who are not religious. Since then, Robert Putnam has published Amazing Grace. Came out just a couple of years ago. in which he elaborates on all of these themes. You don't have to be religious to recognize the ways in which a radical reduction in religiosity in this country has profound social effects on the way the country operates. That is pretty much a brief overview of the formation of the new lower class. What it constitutes is a much larger and growing proportion of the population that is no longer participating in the institutions of American life in ways which historically have enabled this country to work. To put it less technically, I used in the book a chapter on Fishtown, Philadelphia. Fishtown is a working class community that's been a working class community since the Revolution, and a white working class community. And serendipitously, because I did not know this was the case when I started to use Fishtown as my label for the working class, serendipitously you had in the late 1990s a woman named Patricia Smollicone, who was then a graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania and did her doctoral dissertation on using participant observation of Fishtown. And I am told by people in Fishtown that it's okay. Her dissertation, this is not a woman who parachuted in, did a couple of interviews, and went away. She lived there for 2 years. And the word I get from people in Fishtown is she knows what she's talking about. And so I used a chapter in the book to document the human costs of what has happened, where you had a working class community which 50 years ago was a pretty good place to live. And people were really proud of living in Fishtown, and they took care of their own, and they took care of their problems. They probably drank too much, they probably got in fights more often than they should, but it was a functioning community. And it is now no longer a functioning community, and it's a community in which children do not flourish as they once did, and in which human beings, as adults, do not flourish as they once did. Now let me turn to the new upper class. And this is the part I really want to get to because I'm speaking to an audience of Kenyon students. And I know that many of you as individuals are not going to fit the kinds of descriptions I'm going to give. I understand that. It is also true that a number of you will. And so you go ahead and calibrate the way I describe what's been going on with the new upper class against your own life, and you can make up your own minds as to whether you think I'm blowing smoke or not. All right. The formation of the new upper class. We had two things go on in the 20th century that were both in themselves either positively good or at least were neutral. The thing that was positively good was that the United States got much, much better, basically starting in the 1950s, at identifying talent wherever it existed across the country and shipping it off to really good colleges. The example I like to use is from my alma mater, Harvard. 1952, the mean SAT score for verbal for incoming Harvard freshmen was about 587. You have all taken the SAT recently enough to know that you don't write home about an SAT score of 587. That was the average then. Just 8 years later, 1960, the mean SAT verbal score of incoming Harvard freshmen was in the high 600s. Gone up a full standard deviation in 8 years, and very consciously so. Harvard knew what it was doing. It consciously said, we are not going to be a university filled with rich kids, some of whom are smart. We are going to be a university much more meritocratic, filled with really smart kids, some of whom are rich. And it achieved that. It wasn't just Harvard. It happened all over the country, including in places like Kent. That's good. That's what we want. It also has collateral effects down the road. I will come back to those in a minute, but let me first tell you what the second thing was, which was probably good and at least neutral. And that is that over the course of the 20th century, brains became much more valuable in the marketplace. Just simple, raw, intellectual firepower. My favorite example for illustrating this is a person that you have all met. And that is a person with super high visual, spatial, slash mathematics skills who is a complete social klutz. What could that kind of person do to make a living in 1920? Maybe he could be a math professor. But even there, if he doesn't have any social skills at all, that's not a very promising thing. He could be an actuary. There just wasn't much demand for that skill set in the absence of any social skills. What can that same person do today? Well, if he has a knack for programming, which is often true, people with very high visual, spatial, and mathematical skills, he can contemplate very generous offers from Google and Microsoft and Apple and the rest. If he is a pure mathematician, by the way, I am in a university setting and I'm using the masculine pronoun for third person singular. I have a position that I've been promulgating ever since books I wrote in the 1980s, which says that if you're writing, use your own gender as the third person singular if you're the author of the book, and I follow the same practice with speeches. Anyway, if he has that kind of pure mathematical skill, he can be offered by the quant investment hedge funds in New York City and around there wealth beyond the wildest dreams of avarice. That, to be a pure mathematician of high ability now is worth a whole lot. But the same thing happened throughout the occupational structure. Why is it so many of you want to go to law school now? Some of you love the law. But a whole lot of you say, well, it's a good all-purpose degree and also you can make a lot of money being a lawyer. Why can you make a lot of money being a lawyer? You couldn't make that much money being a lawyer in 1920. But basically, if you were a lawyer, you were affluent, you were one of the higher income people in town, but you got the fees that ordinary people could afford to pay for ordinary legal services. What can you make today if you are an attorney with really high cognitive ability and are able to broker a multinational merger? You're worth a commission of millions of dollars. What are you worth if you are an attorney who is really, really good and you can negotiate the labyrinth of the Washington bureaucracy and get the correct ruling on a regulatory issue from the right agency in Washington? You can be worth 4 figures an hour. Same thing has happened with corporate executives, everything else. You take a look at what has happened to the dispersion of the income distribution, and a great deal of it, not all of it, but a great deal of it is due to an actual, honest to God, no kidding, monetary increase in value of brains. You put those two things together and what happens? Well, suppose that you're the CEO of a corporation and you've risen very rapidly and you're still in your mid-30s and you haven't gotten married. If it's 1920, who do you marry at that point? Well, first place, you probably got married when you were 20 years old. You married the girl next door, who was not selected for IQ. If you didn't get married then, you are now going to marry the girl that you married at the country club. She is also not specifically selected for IQ. 2013, who do you marry? This really attractive attorney with a Yale law degree that you met across the table when you were litigating a case. She was explicitly selected for IQ. You have had assortative mating, assortative, I've never known how to pronounce that word, that's been going on now for 50 years, in which one of the collateral effects of bringing really smart people together in universities is they marry each other. And that changes a lot. It first changes the inheritance that they pass down to their kids. Forget about whether it's nature or nurture. The correlation, the statistical correlation between the midpoint of parental IQ and child IQ is about 0.5. And if you have two parents who both have IQs of 135, their kids are going to have a different distribution of IQs than a parent in which one has an IQ of 135 and the other one has an IQ of 105. And that's been going on a whole lot. If you doubt that it's been going on a whole lot, I advise that you go online tonight and bring up last week's Sunday New York Times page for weddings, also known as the mergers and acquisitions page. You will see in there exactly the phenomenon I'm talking about. Really smart, successful people marrying really smart, successful people. Second thing that goes on is it facilitates the development of a distinct culture. I'm trying to, one of the problems that I have is to try to convey to people how different elite neighborhoods are now than they used to be. And the way I came up with the book is I took 14 neighborhoods that were known as being elite neighborhoods in 1960. Upper East Side of New York, Northwest Washington, southern part Westchester County in New York City, the North Shore of Chicago, Beverly Hills and Bel Air. I used census tract data from the 1960 census to compute the median family income in those 14 neighborhoods and also the percentage of adults with college degrees. In those famous elite neighborhoods, the median family income in 1960 was $84,000, expressed in today's dollars. That's not wealth. It's not that rich people didn't live in those neighborhoods, it's that there were a whole lot of other people living there too. You had 50% of the population was making less than $84,000 a year median family income in those neighborhoods. The Upper East Side of New York is ridiculous. It was, I think, the median family income on the Upper East Side of New York, defined as it is now, from the southern end of the park to 96th Street and on from Central Park over the river, was $59,000. That was the median family income for the Upper East Side of New York. For the college degrees, you had 26% with college degrees. Now, what does that mean? It means that the typical family, in a very elite family, probably consisted of one person with a college degree and no more, and another person with a high school diploma. That guarantees a whole lot of cultural diversity just in the socialization process that's going on. Meantime, you have in these universities, the select universities, places like Kennedy, where you have people go out together, you get a critical mass in which a distinct set of tastes and preferences can form a distinct culture. The textbook for describing what has happened is David Brooks' Bobos in Paradise. It was published in 2000, but don't worry about that. It is completely accurate in describing the new upper class culture today. And I really recommend you read it, among other things, because it is really entertaining. It involves everything, from the age at which the new upper class gets married. A lot of you went to pretty good private schools or pretty good public school systems, right? Affluent suburbs. Remember Parents' Night? Remember how geriatric Parents' Night was at those schools? How few women, if it was the elementary school, very few mothers in those schools were still in their 20s or even their early 30s. A whole lot were in their late 30s and early 40s, and with the guys, the sky's the limit in terms of how old they were. That's really different from the rest of America. Child raising practices. This is a case where this gives me an example of something I want to emphasize. When I describe the difference between the new upper class culture and the rest of America, mainstream America, I'm not making comparisons of good and bad. If you talk about the child rearing practices of the new upper class, a lot of them are really good. Virtually every mother in the new upper class breastfeeds, for example. And that's really good for the child. Everybody knows that. Much higher proportion do that than the mothers in the working class. But there can be all sorts of good things about the upper class culture, but which still separate them a whole lot. And it's the segregation and the isolation and the ignorance that I'm trying to emphasize. I use a device in the book, which I understand a lot of you already know about, the test, the quiz, how thick is your bubble? I've been told that the people around Kenyon have been taking it. And you also can, those of you who've taken it, can remember the questions. You know, some of them were very sober, solid, social sciencey questions. Have you ever lived for at least a year in a family with an income below the poverty line? Graduate school doesn't count, that kind of question. But you had a variety of other questions that I think maybe get at the nature of the phenomenon even better. For example, there was the question about, have you or your spouse ever stocked your fridge with mass market domestic beer in the last year? Now, with a college audience, that doesn't quite apply so much, because you do have an economic factor here, but I assure you, among your parents and among those of you who, your elder peers who are now making a little money, they will not buy Coors or Miller or Budweiser. If it is not made by Belgian elves, they aren't buying it. And it's got a dark. Okay, that's kind of frivolous. The most important question, as far as I'm concerned, in that quiz is, have you ever held a job that caused a body part to hurt at the end of the day? If you did not answer yes to that question, you had a problem. you are fundamentally unable to empathize with the very large proportion of the American population who do hold jobs that cause a body part to hurt at the end of the day. I'm not talking necessarily about back-breaking physical labor. If you're just a store clerk standing behind a counter, your feet really hurt at the end of the day, and that counts. What has happened instead is a kind of segregation in which, and now I'm going to go through the recitation, which will not fit a lot of you, but will fit some of you. Here's the life pattern. You are born into an upper middle class family with a fair amount of money. You grow up in a really good suburb or a really good part of the central city. You go to very good schools, public or private. You go from K-12 schools into a selective university. During your summers, you do not work construction. You don't wait tables at Zion National Park. You get an internship at Brookings, or you get an internship at AEI or the Ford Foundation, or someplace like that. You go from those, after you graduate, you go to graduate school, to law school, you get your MBA, and you move seamlessly into a career that has allowed you to go from infancy to adulthood without ever coming in contact with a very large part of America. Why is this a big deal? Why is this bad? Because there's an asymmetry that's going on. Well, no, there are two reasons. Let me back off from that. Let me tell you one reason it's bad. It is because your life has been diminished. Not all of the interesting people in the world live on the Upper East Side of New York. They do not all have IQs of 130. They do not all work in managerial or professional positions. They are a very diverse and funny and interesting and praiseworthy bunch. And by having no contact with them, by having no idea what their lives are like, your own life is diminished. And it will be a lot better for you in terms of the richness of your life if you are in contact with mainstream America. But however, if you want to turn from that to the practical, it's this. Whether a truck driver in Wichita understands the priorities and the anxieties of a senior cabinet official in Washington is unimportant. Because that truck driver cannot do one damn thing to affect the life of that senior cabinet official. That senior cabinet official is making decisions that will affect the life of the truck driver. And if you do not have a gut level understanding of what life is like for the truck driver, a way to empathize, point number one is you lack a very important aspect of humility that you really, really need. And the second thing is you're going to make dumb mistakes. You are going to be a Mayor Bloomberg. You are going to say, oh, well, they shouldn't be drinking those great big soft drinks, and so I'm going to help them out. You're going to be a nanny. You are going to say, let me help you. Let me emphasize something here. There was a very interesting interaction I had today with a number of students here in Kenya, in a smaller group. And there was one very important question, good question. But the way it was phrased was, are you saying that if I don't have these kinds of experiences, I cannot understand the priorities and needs of somebody in the Mississippi Delta? To which the answer is no, you can't. But that's not what struck me about the question. If you're a Kenyan student and you are thinking about these people from whom you're isolated, you know who you're first going to think of? You're going to think of black, impoverished people in the Delta. You're going to think about people in the inner city. You're going to think about Latinos who are suffering under all sorts of disadvantages. You aren't going to think about insurance agents in Toledo. You aren't going to think about plumbers and electricians who aren't impoverished. They aren't downtrodden. They're just sort of ordinary Americans. It's really important that you understand them. This idea that what the upper class has to do is to understand the least advantaged, the most disadvantaged members of society, but they can ignore all the rest, is, I think, a pernicious collateral effect of a lot of the socialization that goes on in the colleges today. People ought to be more interested than they are at understanding the millions and millions of Americans who are out there trying to make a living and doing pretty good at it, So this is the formation of the new upper class. When I talk about it to audiences that consist of members of the new upper class, which I have had occasion to do, I find a very interesting set of reactions. Because a great many of the adult audiences that I talk to consist of very successful people. Sometimes they are, I suppose, if not billionaires, close to it. A lot of other times they are in senior professional positions and very influential, but they grew up in working class or middle class homes. If you grew up in a working class or middle class home, you can live on Park Avenue now. You can be in a $10 million cooperative duplex or triplex or whatever, but you still remember what life was like in Pittsburgh when you were growing up there in a working class home. And if I were to put you in a bus and send you off to Middle America and put you off in the middle of the night, you could just navigate your way around just fine. It's the next generation that's the problem. We have people that are already in positions of power who have never had any experience except that of the upper middle class moment. And that's what's scary. And what I see when I address those audiences is the older members of the audience nodding their head in agreement. And the way I sometimes put it with them is to say, look, think about the experiences you had in life that made you what you are today. And then think about the life you have given your children. And to what extent have you systematically stripped your children of the kinds of experiences that benefited you the most? And that's when I see heads nodding. The isolation of the new upper class, unfortunately, has a whole lot of natural forces that will tend to perpetuate it. Because I am not depicting a world in which people are acting badly. I'm talking about parents who want to give a better life to their kids than they had. I'm talking about parents who made some money and they want to move to a suburb that has prestige and has nice houses and has good school systems. All of these things are completely normal kinds of things for people to want to do. They simply have effects that we have not contemplated in the past. What do we do about all of this? Libertarians aren't very good at solutions. It's not something we do well because there is no government program that we think is going to make any difference. And we're generally right. I don't try to present any systematic solutions in the book. I do present an optimistic scenario and a pessimistic scenario. The pessimistic scenario says that all is lost. The pessimistic scenario says, look, these are natural forces that we are not going to reverse. There is nothing that is going to reverse the increasing monetary value of brains in the marketplace. That is going to continue indefinitely. We don't want to reverse a collegiate system which brings talent into good universities no matter where it comes from. That's a good thing. We don't want to change that. So these natural forces, and we also aren't going to change the impulse of parents to try to give their kids a better life. So all of these natural forces are going to combine to lead us down the path we are headed. Look, the new upper class is comfortable with things the way they are. They're very comfortable with things the way they are. Why should they change? But what's the incentive? Meanwhile, there is not a clamoring from the working class that we want to have drastic changes in the way the country is run. So this prospect says that two things will happen. Over the course of the next 15, 20 years, the United States will become a social democracy indistinguishable from that of Europe, an outcome which many of you in this room think would be a great outcome. And we will also move toward a class system which increasingly reflects an aristocratic class system of the kind that Europe is familiar with. In Europe, they have never had a civic culture in which people were proud of being part of the middle class. You have never had French intellectuals trying to say, hey, I'm just an ordinary guy. And that French farmer and I were brothers under the skin. French intellectuals have never wanted to be that way. Neither have intellectuals or the upper class in other European countries. They have always accepted the fact that there are people on top and there are people on the bottom, and you don't have anything in common. What's the point? The American civic culture was founded on this identity of Americanness, of being part of this. It's much more important that you be an American than it was that you be on top or the bottom. So, lots of natural forces pushing us in that direction. There are another couple of things that make the pessimistic scenario more likely. And that is the proposition that the new upper class is as dysfunctional in its own way as the new lower class. If you look at the trajectory of civilizations, something that a variety of historians have commented on is a common theme, which is that in the growth trajectory of a civilization, the people who run the country have a lot of confidence in the rightness of their own values. And they communicate that. Arnold Toynbee characterized this as the creative minority, which sort of carries the rest of society along with it by propagandizing its values. And there are lots of historical examples of how that happened. The new upper class has no confidence in its values whatsoever. They will not preach what they practice. They will not say, gee, we get married, and we work long hours, and we do this and that and the other thing, but we can't say that getting married is a good thing for other people. It's all relative. We don't want to be judgmental about this. Well, there's a problem with that. At dinner, we were talking about this, and I had to make clear something I want to make clear to you. I am not saying that the new upper class should say, we are right, and we want all the rest of you to follow along in our footsteps. I want the new upper class to embrace other Americans for doing everything right, but right now get no validation for their behavior. You have throughout working class and middle class America right now all sorts of people who are working hard, trying hard, doing the right things, raising their kids right. They get nobody saying from the upper class, you were the good guys. Because for the new upper class to say you are the good guys and to treat them and to establish social norms which embrace them as the good guys mean there are people who are not good guys. I understand why, with a lot of problems, you don't want to demonize people. I understand why people don't want to demonize single mothers, for example. I don't want to demonize single mothers. But that doesn't mean we're helpless. We can, for example, demonize single dads. There are all sorts of reasons not to say that a single woman who's trying her damnedest to do well by her children don't have to make life difficult for her. Exactly why is it that we shouldn't say of a man who has impregnated a woman and walked away from his responsibilities that he's a bum, that he is despicable? Why should it not be taken for granted that to behave in that way is to incur the censure of your fellow citizens? Seems to me a perfectly reasonable thing to do. And in lots of other ways as well, I want the new upper class, for heaven's sakes, to stop holding itself aloof from the rest of life of the rest of the country and to identify with the other people in the country who deserve our admiration. The other thing that's happened that scares me about the new upper class is the loss of a sense of unseemliness. You know, it is not nostalgia, it is a statement of fact. And people of the older generation here can verify that. That 50 years ago, you had all sorts of corporate executives who made plenty of money. They could easily afford to buy a Cadillac, which is the only luxury car around at that time. We did that, BMWs and so forth. Who could have easily afforded to buy a Cadillac and didn't do it. They drove Buicks or they drove Mercuries or Oldsmobiles or something. Why didn't they buy a Cadillac? Because they would be showing off. They would be getting too big for their britches. It never even crossed their minds to build a house of 12,000 square feet. It never crossed their minds, even though they could have done it with the income they had. Because to do that would be sort of flaunting in the face of your neighbors. I'm richer than you, I'm better than you, and the rest of it. They wouldn't do it. It would be unseemly. As far as I can tell, that sense of unseemliness has pretty much disappeared. And with that, you have had a lot of complaints that are usually phrased in terms of the 99% and the 1% that I agree with. It's not 1% in terms of income that's the problem. It's the new upper class, but that's okay. The basic notion that you have a new upper class that is perfectly happy saying to the world, look what I got and what you don't have. That willingness to do that is kind of an explicit giving the finger to the civic culture that America used to pride itself upon. So in all those ways, the pessimistic scenario is such that if you said I had to bet 20% of the net worth of the Murray family on the outcome, I'm going to go with the pessimistic outcome as the most likely. However, the more optimistic outcome is not a 0% chance. It is far greater than 0. The first is simply that people have gone broke repeatedly, underestimating the ability of the United States to affect cultural changes. I can't recite the statistics for you exactly, but they have basically the per capita alcohol assumption in 1820, which is some phenomenal figure measured in gallons per person of whiskey consumed, and then the alcohol consumption as of the early 1830s, where it had just plummeted. What happened? It was one of the religious great awakenings that we have had in the past, where there were huge cultural changes that occurred very quickly. Let me give you 2 other examples. There was a civil rights movement. Civil rights movement went from a standing start in 1954, basically, to the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964. That's a really short period of time for a major change in consciousness of the part of the American people. And the other example is what happened with smoking. In intellectual circles, smoking went from something that everybody did in 1966, 1967 to something almost nobody did by the mid-1970s. You became social pariah if you did. So there are reasons to think that the United States can turn. And the other optimistic point I would make is that as I talk about these issues with people from across the political spectrum, there is broad agreement that the problem is real. And there is a very powerful, continuing allegiance to and affection for the traditional American civic culture that crosses political lines. And insofar as that is the case, the message that I try to convey to the new upper class is, I don't want you to sacrifice yourselves. That's really un-American in some respects. I want you instead to think about the choices you are making for yourself and your children, and ask yourself if you have gotten very good at living a glossy life, but that what you need more of is a textured life. And that to live a textured life means to be in the midst of other people around you, sharing in their birth, death, joys, sorrows, the intimate stuff of life. And to do that, you can't continue to live in a bubble. I do not have a 5-point government program for making that come about. What I do is write books. Insofar as this book can help trigger the conversations that will trigger that cultural change, I will rest satisfied. Thank you very much. I point to people, right? I saw a hand go up back there.
Come up to the microphone, please.
Oh, they're going to find out. Are you telling me at Kingman College I don't have any questions whatsoever? Yeah. It's hard to get out of the middle of the row. That's why I don't get the question.
You mentioned the big period between the 1960s and 2010. Do you think the 60s citizens were motivated by post-World War II, I guess, sense of nationality, or do you think it was merely a steady effect from the Cold War period, slowly stagnating towards the end?
As what went wrong in the 1960s?
Well, what caused the change, where we started at a high base point?
Well, okay, so you're asking about causes. first place, I don't think I had a simple-minded view. You had the invention of the pill and its distribution in 1960, which meant there was going to be a sexual revolution with profound consequences. You had the feminist revolution, which transformed the role of women in the workplace. That was going to have profound consequences, as it did. But you also, during the 1960s, had a series of changes in the rules of the game as they applied to poor people. And the rules, as they had previously been defined, were changed in ways that made, especially for young people, decisions that would be disastrous in the long term look okay in the short term. And this ranges from everything from the economics of having a baby without a husband, to the penalties of acting up in school, to the cost-benefit analysis of committing crime. It ranged across the board. And because you changed the rules of the game in these ways, you ended up by triggering a variety of social phenomena that then took on a life of their own. So I don't think that you can turn the clock back by changing a few social policies that I think were mistaken in the 1960s. I think that what we're looking at now are cultural phenomena that are only going to be changed by cultural changes.
I grew up in San Francisco, so I'm interested what your thoughts are on the phenomenon that I know quite well. I'm not sure if you studied or thought about it very much, but it seems applicable, which is there's a neighborhood in San Francisco called the Mission District.
I'm sorry, say that
The
again.
Mission District in San Francisco, there's a neighborhood. It used to be largely Latino working class. And now, over the last 2 decades or so, huge numbers of people like Penny, students, upper middle class, upper class white people, from a place like Penny moved in. They get jobs in either creative work or in nowadays much more tech startups. And they push out the previously living there Latino community. It seems applicable to what you're talking about. I'm interested in, you told me today that you would rather have me go work at Brookings. You'd rather have me go live in Thailand for 3 years. Do you think this is a similar thing, where rather than going and working for Brookings, they would move into a neighborhood that still has high crime rates and still has very cheap rent, run-down houses, et cetera, Is it similar? But it seems inherently problematic to me. It seems like a very sad thing that's happening.
I have to apologize because my hearing is not all it should be, so I don't know if I understood everything. Insofar as I understood what you said, do I think it would be a good idea for you to do something like move in a neighborhood like that?
Also, I'm really interested in your thoughts on gentrification as a process.
Oh, gentrification as such.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, by the time that gentrification occurs, there's already usually been a disintegration in the neighborhood. And I don't mean that that's always true, but I'm thinking of Fishtown, this white working class neighborhood in Philadelphia, which since the 1990s had started to gentrify. And in one way that has destroyed the neighborhood, but in another way, it didn't really, because Fishtown was already dead in terms of the things that had made it work before. That isn't always true. You sometimes have gentrification come in and dislocate communities that were perfectly functional. But by and large, I don't see that as a major phenomenon driving the kinds of things I've been talking about. I can't be more precise than that. I've not made a specific study. I'm going to go over to this side, and then I'll go back to this side. Okay, I'll go over this side.
Hi. So I want to note first that I did agree with you said that you're not just in causes in, as a libertarian, you're not necessarily in providing a government solution. But with some of you talking about how single mothers necessarily can't go to PTA because they have too much to do, or public schools are bad in low-income areas, and people, like
entirely my own bias, I have no way of seeing how that is not a problem. That is something that has been institutionalized by American government policies over the years. It's something we cannot further fix by saying, maybe if there's a low-income school district, we give the school more funding. Or maybe if people don't understand that you need to not have a child or marry the person you had a child with, if you can't afford to keep that child healthy on your own, then we provide contraception, sex education, to make that known in the schools. Currently, it doesn't seem like that's the case. And I wonder how you would sort of relate that idea to your, I guess, your own political views as a libertarian. And yeah.
Okay, well, let's stick with the schools for first place. Let's treat this as an empirical problem, first of all, because we've had several decades now of all kinds of social programs, and we have also had, usually government-funded, evaluations of those programs. That's how I made my living here in the 1970s. I worked for one of the research companies that did evaluations of social programs. So we have a big empirical record of what happens when you increase per pupil expenditures in low-income areas, when you have augmented educational programs specifically targeted under Title I of the Education Act for low-income schools. Almost every single one of the things you would like to see done to help ameliorate the problems, we have a record of, and it is utterly dismal. Utterly dismal. The ability of social programs to manipulate these kinds of outcomes is very limited, even in something like education, where you'd say we ought to be able to do that. So now we are in a situation with regard to education, for example, if you go to the Washington, D.C. schools, we're spending on the order of $20 grand a child. I mean, there are high expenditures. It's clearly not that, oh, these schools are way underfunded, whereas these other schools have lots more funding, and those kids do so much better because of better schools. We have had evaluations going back to the Coleman Report in the 1960s, and we have shelf after shelf of evaluations since then, which say, you know what, it's basically family background that explains variance in academic achievement in schools, and we do not know how, under the current public school system, to use government programs to jack up academic achievement. So I guess that I would appeal to you purely on the basis of empiricism here, that let's look at the record of attempts to use the government to solve these problems. It doesn't work.
That actually follows really well my question, which is, you mentioned earlier, it seems a pretty central theme of this whole discussion and the solutions, how it is to reward people from the lower class who do the right things, as you said before. And I would assume that would be like kind of adhere to this for American virtues, all kinds of weird. And it's, so I assume that's now it's going to be in the private sector, and then be like giving people jobs. And I'm wondering, like, firstly, what are those things you would reward? Would it be industrious? Because that really seems like the one thing that you can reward in the private economical sector, which leaves out honest American religiosity, which I don't necessarily know if those can be rewarded in the private sector in a financial sense. And yeah, so what things would reward and how would we reward those? Would it be financial? Would it be like sort of a cultural, going to your country club, which doesn't really solve much of the problems?
You know, this is one of the things that's hardest to talk about systematically, because look, how is the social norms come about? Let's go back to the example we've been referring to periodically throughout my presentation, and this is versus the single living. There used to be complete, utter, uniform, seamless stigma associated with that behavior. And single women were demonized for having kids. Okay, so you had that for a period of history that extends from the beginning of the Republic to the early 1960s. How did that come about? It didn't come about because of anything you could put your finger on. It is that when people talked about these issues, whether it was over the dinner table, whether it was parents talking to children, whether it was preachers in the pulpit, in all of the millions of conversations that go on throughout culture within a given day, this was a thing which in all sorts of ways became the consensus of how things are supposed to be. If you are going to have cultural change, what happens is that a million conversations start to change. I use the phrase preach what you practice, and the reaction in the book, I think some people said, does he want us to take bullhorns and go down to working class communities and stand there and random people? No. Start talking differently about these issues at a dinner table that's completely filled with people just like you. And that's the way culture changes. You don't do this through financial rewards. You don't do it through those kinds of things. It is an honest, in this case, admiration of people who are doing the right thing. And that can communicate itself. That can communicate itself in the way you treat somebody who's in a blue-collar job who does a really good job for you. It can communicate itself in an honest expression of, you really did a good job. Or, a higher tip if you're eating a meal. But it's, culture is in the air. And I know that that's not a satisfactory way of characterizing it, but that's the truth.
First, I'd like to say thank you for coming, and I thought before you had some questions that you more or less.
Are you going to read that whole page again?
Issue of crime and honesty and integrity that you're going to move on. I was wondering if the spike in crime in Fishtown compared to Belmont and other lower class areas couldn't be because of more unwanted children due to lack of education on how to use contraception or access to it or access to abortion clinics, the latter being the hypothesis that legalizing accessible abortions leads to a reduction in crime rates as opposed to a breakdown of honesty and marriage with America. I was wondering what your view on that was.
Well, thankfully, this was a simple one, which is to say that the rise in crime, which began in about 1964-65 and became very steep, predates the phenomena you're talking about. And it was really steep, the rise in crime at that time. And there is a fairly simple explanation for that. During the same period, in the last half of the 60s and early 70s, when we had, I don't want to give the actual number, I'm not sure the proportion, it was just like this, the number of prisoners in this country, I don't mean the number of prisoners per 1,000 crimes, I mean the raw number of prisoners went down. At the same time we had a huge increase in crime, the raw number of people in prison in the United States fell. That's a pretty straightforward coincidence of trends. Guess what? Crime began to pay a whole lot better than it had before. The risks went way down, and lo and behold, we got a whole lot more crime. That antedates anything having to do with Steve Levitt's hypothesis about abortions and the rest of it.
And my second question is just about what cultural background difference do you think is it that separates upper class children from getting further education compared to lower class children? You don't believe that funding the schools in K-12 makes a significant difference. What cultural aspect is making the difference in childhood performance?
Well, you've got first simply ability, which is the factor which has to be taken into account. And you have, I know this is heretical to you, but if you take mean IQ levels across different socioeconomic classes, you get different proportions of kids who are going to be able to go to college. But the cultural aspect is really important as well. You grow up in an upper middle class background, it is expected you are going to go to college. And you know that from day one, and that's factored into the way you think about it. And that will increase the odds that you will, in fact, go to college. But now you are in danger of getting me off onto a rant on the theme of the BA is the work of the devil. And I don't think I want to get into this at this time, because I think what we have done with the higher education system is a crime in terms of providing the kinds of opportunities to people throughout the socioeconomic level, range, to find what they love to do and learn how to do it well and become successes at it. That's a whole different topic, however.
Thank you very much.
Just kind of a specific question regarding something that one of the white men are using more lazy and
What about a white man? A white man is out of the labor force.
correct.
Even more becoming lazy.
Of that you contribute to more women entering the workforce, unless it would be for the man or family to be doing the majority of the work, and what other shortcomings you see on just focusing on men, which is half the
No,
problem.
that in 1960, if you were a man working a low-income job and supporting your wife and children, you were probably the only source of support, and you had prestige in your community. You were looked up to in your community, and you were looked up to by the larger society. And as women became more economically independent, entered the workforce and so forth, a lot of that status associated with that went away. And it's another case of a good thing. More women coming into the kinds of careers they want, having collateral effects that are problematic. Didn't affect people in the upper class, the upper middle class. The men still had sources of prestige that made them feel good about their position. But for low-income guys, their role in their communities took a real body blow. I think it's a big deal in explaining a lot of that.
Mr. Murray, you said, or at least I got the impression that you said that a lot of the formation of the new upper class was due, and to a large extent, to America's meritocracy. You believe that, right? That people who are more talented are coming together at colleges and universities, and they're having kids, and those kids will also, through either natural or biological causes, also be more talented. So you believe that, right?
Well, I would rephrase it slightly, which is we brought together a critical mass. For the same reason that the Amish can establish a local culture that is distinctive from the larger culture because they established local critical mass, you also had in the elite universities a local critical mass that developed in the last 50 years that did not exist before.
And so it would seem that this would be in and of itself, if your proposition is correct, it would be just because these people have worked hard and they have these skills available to them to become part of this elite. But to me, it seems more like that your assertion isn't exactly correct. The assertion that it's the people who have the work the hardest and who are the most intelligent who've gotten to the top. Like, for instance, I know that for a large, one of the reasons I'm here is because I have money. And I know that there are people who are smarter than me, much smarter than me, people who are my friends from back home that didn't have opportunity to go to a university like this because they just didn't have the money. So I was just wondering how you would defend your claim that the formation of this new upper class is primarily due to merit rather than just inheritance.
Well, I didn't say it was just. Insofar as you give kids who formerly would not have had access to these kinds of opportunities, I think that's a good thing. I wouldn't have gone to Harvard for Newton, Iowa 20 years before I actually went, so I think that's good. But there is nothing that I've ever said or written, either in this book or in the Bell Curve or any other book, which says, oh, these people deserve their success, and that's just fine because of that. On the contrary, if there is one thing that is absolutely the luck of the draw, it's your IQ. None of us deserves our IQ, whether it's high or low. Pure luck of the draw.
Thank you.
That's okay. Okay. First of all, I'm interested in the idea of working on your feet or working in a way that makes your body ache being something that was intuitive for people in working class. Can you say that's a bit reductive, considering that people in the working class aren't just working jobs to make their body ache? They're working them knowing that they have to keep working them in order to succeed. And there's also the idea that they're working them for a profit that's necessary for their survival.
Well, let me put it this way. If you go work, have you ever worked as a server in a restaurant?
Yes.
Okay? I assert, you can correct me if I'm wrong, you will never eat in a restaurant again with the same attitude toward the servers that you had before you had that job. You understand all sorts of things about just because the food came out late doesn't necessarily mean it was the server's fault. Or if the steak is overcooked, that's definitely not the server's fault. You have a way of empathizing with what goes on with that job. That's really a good thing that will last you the rest of your life. And insofar as you have had something that a body part hurt at the end of the day because of your job, you can look at somebody else who has that kind of outcome at the end of the day, and you have some basis for saying, I know how you feel.
I agree with you, but I think that's only one aspect of what it means to empathize with the working class.
Well, I'm okay with that. I agree with you on that. It's a real good start.
So why do you think that the solution then to this idea of the upper class is for them to applaud, so to speak, the working class? Doesn't that seem a little bit, I don't want to use the word condescending, but I think it's appropriate in some ways, in that if you're authorizing the upper class to say that they should look down to the middle and lower classes and say, I like your work ethic, or I like your American attitude, isn't that in itself problematic because it's instilling the same hierarchy that can be seen as oppressive to a lot of Americans in society?
Well, I think we are just about to pass the night. To me, as I look around at my fellow human beings, there are some people that I'm really enthusiastic about because I think they are behaving in ways that I admire and they are fighting against the odds. And for me to express my admiration for them, to withhold that admiration would be immoral. That to express my admiration for them is part of my obligation as a member of the community. And it is, okay, I said it as best I can say it.
Thank you.
Well, I am not so related directly to this. I'm actually an international student from Latin America, Venezuela. And my question, I don't know if it's going to open in Canada, you don't want to open right now, but it's going towards the process of globalization. I understood the scenarios, like not necessarily solutions, but the scenarios that you presented on how these, cultural change could go in the future to recover those like, cultural values that Americans used to have or before. Or, I understand that you have these scenarios and then possibly eliminate one, but I just wonder how is it when you include the factor that like globalization and like immigration is affecting so much not only the United States but everything in the past. Like you didn't mention that. I know it's a big topic, but what did you say about that?
Clearly, something like globalization has all sorts of cascading impacts on all sorts of things. And those impinge on the kinds of outcomes I've been talking about with certainly for the lower class, but also it accounts for a lot of the increasing prosperity in the upper class. So I would not deny that at all. I guess I'd summarize it like this. We have had this tangle of things happen over the last 50 years, some of which I emphasized, others of which other people emphasized, and let's agree that a lot of these all played in to the outcomes that we're looking at in complicated ways. But that, at this point, what we are looking at is different from the immediate outcomes. Let's take globalization, for example. And suppose one of the immediate outcomes of a guy having his job taken away from him because it was sent overseas is that he goes out and he continues to try to look for a job and he gets discouraged, and it's a classic case of globalization creating somebody out of the labor force. Okay? But then 5, 10 years, 10 years on, I'm saying, you know what, there has also been a cultural change at this point, where even if the jobs come back, that cultural change means that guy's still going to be out of the labor force. And so that what we are now facing is a cultural problem that must be addressed by whatever other means. We have to add cultural change as part of the solution.
I want to give everybody waiting.
Okay? Okay. So we will do these, and I'll make my answers brief.
I'm an overgraduate again, so this may be a question, not a question, just a few observations. I'm a little surprised you didn't mention the soaring cost of higher education, which is a big issue now. And,
Don't get us started.
my Kenyan degree cost me, I think, $12,000, not including the visa. Now it's about $250,000. There's been this concern that higher higher education now is an engine for social stratification.
Yeah.
The other observation, when I listened to you, I kept thinking of Wall Street moguls. If any people are tone deaf to how other Americans look at them, this is a classic example of this isolation of people who seem to be clueless.
And unseemliness.
Yeah. The last observation I made was one thing that kind of would support your analysis in a sense is I remember reading that someone said that Americans from 1929 to 1945 across the social spectrum had a common experience of the stock market crash, the Great Depression, and deprivation. We're kind of like we're all in this together, and we have to defeat Hitler and Tojo. And that did explain why these upper middle class people in the 50s wouldn't show off their wealth as much. And, but now you have less of a feeling that we're all in it together. It's kind of like someone told me it's called Iggy Yo-Yo. I got mine, you're on your own. But I think we don't have any kind of harmful experience since 45 where Americans, except 9/11, which
That was ephemeral.
yeah, I don't know where the bond is when you have all this diversity of organizations. It's very hard to get shared values today compared to, let's say, half a century ago.
I agree with all three observations.
You mentioned Putnam a few times. Do you see the views on associations as kind of a new solution or a solution in general for the new upper class to connect with lower classes?
I'm not familiar with Putnam's, does he have proposals for resuscitating
I mean,
associations?
I guess it's not really his proposals, but do you see like better associations between classes as kind of a new solution?
Well, yeah, in the first place, I think associations are a critical part of the social capital. I think I agree with him on that point. I think associations come into being because they serve a function. And insofar as communities have the action, insofar as communities have to solve problems that they won't get solved, you get a lot more associations. I think one of the things we've seen happen in local communities is that you have had the government say, we'll take care of that. And it's been shipped off to bureaucracies, and a lot of motivation for doing associations has passed. And our last question, or observation.
Yes, you described this process of divergence between the different classes in society, and I've noticed a similar kind of effect. And I think that it leads to a situation where there's no longer a common understanding of words, objects, meanings. For example, one person uses the term tolerance, and as a libertarian, what's commonly understood as tolerance many times seems equally intolerant to me. And it makes it so that we no longer can have a rational dialogue about issues. And it seems to me that there's this widening gap in comprehension or understanding between classes or segments of society. So my question is, does that just continue to widen and do we completely lose touch with each other? Or is there some way that we can bridge that gap so that we once again are able to have discussions and rationally work out the problem?
You have asked a question I cannot answer. As I indicated, I don't know which way we're going to go. I think the reality is that it's more fun to live in a world in which you are able to communicate across classes and you interact across classes. And insofar as I'm right on that, then it really is more fun and more rewarding than we have hoped. But I think you're right about the different language, so that in the working class, a lot of things that are said in the upper class just seem like idiocy. And there's no, and vice versa. I'll just finish with one last comment. My wife has a saying, which I think is quite true, that she derived from being at Washington dinner parties, whereby that if you are at a dinner party where you know everybody else pretty much agrees with you, the average IQ at the table drops by 20 points, because you know you aren't going to be challenged, and so you say things that you really wouldn't like to defend against an argument. I want to commend Kenyon for arranging the dinner party tonight in a way in which all of us, certainly speaking for myself, found myself challenged, and maybe my IQ didn't drop as much as it would otherwise. It's been fun. Thank you very much.